I'm the book review editor of the Journal of Romanian Studies, and I'm pleased to invite you to the second installment of the newly launched Journal of Romanian Studies book talk series, meant to bring together the authors and editors of the books presented in the journal with the scholars who reviewed their work. With these panel discussions, we hope to continue a dialogue started before we commissioned the reviews, and in doing so to promote conversations about issues pertinent to Romanian studies from an international perspective. Our guests tonight are Sabrina Ramet, the editor of the essay collection Interwar East Central Europe, 1918 to 1941, The Failure of Democracy Building, the Fate of Minorities, published by Routledge last year. Roland Clark, contributor to the book, and Francesco Magno, whose review of the book will be published in the forthcoming issue of the Journal of Romanian Studies. So thank you all for agreeing to participate to this panel. I will introduce the panelists and then tell you a few things about our agenda, so to speak, for today, which is no ordinary. Sabrina Ramet is Professor Emerita.
Ramet, if I may pronounce Ramet like Chevrolet or Gourmet.
Okay, Ramet, okay, thank you. So Sabrina Ramet is Professor Emerita of Political Science at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, Norway. Her main areas of research are East European history and politics and religion and politics. She's the author of 14 books, most recently of the Catholic Church in Polish history from 1966 to the present, which was published with Palgrave Macmillan in 2017, An Alternative to Democracy in 20th Century Europe, Collectivist Visions of Modernity, published with the Central European University Press in 2019. She's also the editor or co-editor of around 40 books, to my count. Roland Clark is a senior lecturer in modern European history at the University of Liverpool, UK, and a senior fellow with the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, based in UK. He's also the acting president of the Society for Romanian Studies. He researches and writes on anti-Semitism, fascism, the Holocaust, lived religion, theology, nationalism, and gender. He published his first book, Holy Legionary Youth, Fascist Activism in Interwar Romania, in 2015, both in English with Cornell University Press and in Romanian translation with Polyrom. And his second book, Sectarianism and Renewal in 1920s Romania, The Limits of Orthodoxy and Nation Building, was published recently with Bloomsbury. Last but not least, Francesco Magno is a PhD candidate at the University of Trento in Italy. His research focuses on the history of judiciary and the legal profession in interwar Romania. In 2018, he was awarded the Romanian Cultural Institute Fellowship for Foreign Scholars. So welcome one and all, and now on to the agenda for the talk. The aim is to have a 45 minute long discussion, including possible questions from the audience. So those of you on Zoom, you can intervene probably directly or leave us your questions in the chat. And those of you watching on Facebook, please leave your questions in the contents, in the comment sections of the event. As far as the topics for discussion, first I would be interested in finding out from Sabrina, the editor of the book and of many other books, some opening remarks, not necessarily about the content of the book itself, but about the process of writing, editing, and publishing the book. And then perhaps as a contributor to the book, Roland might also offer his take on this process, and then together with Francesco, talk about the content of the book and address some of its main points. And then towards the end of tonight's panel, we can take some questions from the audience, if any. And finally, since this is an event organized by the Journal of Romanian Studies, I would like to invite Roland to preview the next issue of the journal, which will be published in April, by talking a bit about his article, analyzing the dominant frameworks of interwar Romanian history. So I think that's enough for me from now. Sabrina, could you please talk a bit about the 3 years of working on a project like this, like reaching out to contributors, keeping in touch with the publisher? What were some of the challenges and some of the rewards of bringing this book to life?
Well, the history of this book on interwar goes back at least as far as 2005. So we're not talking about it just popping up in 3 years. Although I'm a political scientist, I've taught Eastern Europe in my East Europe class as a history class, starting with the reign of Maria Theresa, so 1740. And in fact, even casting my eye back a little bit to 1683, which those of you who know East European history will understand at once was a big year for Vienna. In the course of that, of teaching that class, I would have assigned 4 texts, one of which was devoted to interwar East Central Europe. And the obvious choice was the book with the University of Washington Press by Rothschild. There's a couple of the books which have come out are really fine, but this one has the strength of being about politics, about covering all the countries systematically, and in that regard quite attractive. But I found increasingly that I was not fully satisfied with all of the chapters, even though they did their purpose, even though it worked very well as a textbook, and I thought that we could do something a bit better. Then there was the question of what and when, and already in academic year 2005-06, I was visiting scholar at Georgetown University and raised this issue with a friend of mine who is a commissioning editor. And she thought the idea of making a new book was a good one, but I only turned to this, I guess, Julia, you said it was 3 years ago, so maybe that was when it was.
Well, that's what I read in the preface. So I know that these are longer projects.
It seems to me it must have been at least, 3 years to the date of writing that preface. If I wrote the preface in, let's say, 2018, then we're talking about 2015 to launch this, which would sound about right. At any rate, the issue then with putting together an edited work is to, first of all, there are different ways of doing this. There's some people who just say, I want to have a book. If you got an idea, send me your ideas and I'll put them in the book. This is, I think, the worst way to put together a book, because you get an absolute grab bag of things. And since the people are volunteers, although you could get a lot of excellent chapters that way, maybe they won't be all the same level of quality. I do the book differently. What I do is, option A, the other was option B. We start with B, then go to A. Option A is for the editor to say, conceptualize, what do I want in the book? And then come up with a set of chapters. Decide who would be ideal to write each chapter, and then invite those people. And so Roland was invited to write on Romania. I typically do the introduction to any book I edit. I don't think I've ever had anybody else do it. I've seen it done, the editor then hires somebody else to do the introduction. That's possible, but if the editor has the idea about the book, then those ideas should be an introduction, so that comes out that way. Getting it published involves typically, if you're going to a good press, you're going through a review process. And the review process is highly variable. I had 2 books along the way, and since this is going to be broadcast over the entire planet and perhaps to other galaxies as well, I am not going to say which ones they were, but I had one press which took 2 years on the review process, and along the way, 1 or 2 of my contributors gave up, dropped out of the book. Fortunately, not critical chapters. I had another publisher that accepted the book in a timely way, but then took at least 2, if not 3 years in the production process, which is far too long. And it might have even been 4 years. And that was because of internal turmoil at that press. So that's something that can be kept in mind by people. An editor of a book always needs to be prepared to step in and write a chapter that's not delivered. Now, this particular book, I didn't have to do that, but I had a book on Orthodox churches, In that book, you see I wrote a chapter on the Albanian Orthodox Church. What am I doing with Albania? Well, my contributor dropped out. So his doctor advised him that he shouldn't be working so much. So he just stopped all of his work. And I then, fortunately, there's a lot about Albania in Italian sources. And I know Italian. And there's some in Serbo-Croatian sources, and of course, German and English. So using those languages, I was able to write that. And there are a few other examples, but you know, you don't need examples. I've made the point. An editor has to be prepared to step in, either to contract somebody else to fill in when somebody drops out, or delivers substandard, you know, the substandard work, or to write it oneself. Review process. I told you it can take a long, long time. It can also be fast. I've had publishers turn it around in a month.
Wow.
At least 2 different publishers, one based mainly in the US with an American branch office, and one based in the United States. And just within a month, I had positive reviews, able to move forward. This is very nice. If you're lucky to have such a fast turnaround. And then of course there's the review process. And a very obvious point to make, but I'm going to make it anyway, even though it's obvious. The people who are contributing to a book are typically not getting paid. Very, very, very rarely have I paid contributors. So there are a couple of books in the Civic Values series where I had money to pay contributors. I think for 2 of the volumes, maybe 3. But they typically are not getting paid. So the people who are contributing are paying it, they are contributing, they're writing these pieces, these chapters, in order to, because they have something to say, or because they want to influence the dialogue on that particular topic, or we could say for glory. There was a little bit of glory in this field, as we all know. And so the editor has to be mindful of that. So, and even if the editor is paying people, it's very important to show an appreciation of people's work. Always give praise when possible. Always show respect for the contributors. Always be polite. I've observed these rules from the very beginning. I didn't have to learn them along the way. I mean, this I knew instinctively. But I was also involved in a project where the coordinator, the editor, was extremely rude to me, and a couple of times over, I dropped out of the project. What am I doing? You know, working with somebody who's rude to me? I'm not going to do that. So this is critical. Have to be polite. Want to be a nice person, just in general. But quite apart from that, it's sensible. And I will share with you my definition of pragmatic. There are a lot of different definitions of pragmatic. My definition of pragmatic is behaving and speaking and writing in such a way that you get the result you want. That's pragmatic. And so that's it. There was one other thing to add about this book. When there was went through the review process for my introduction, the initial run through, there was a suggestion that I add a chapter on peasant parties. I thought that was a good idea, so I contracted Robert Bideleur to write that. He did a fabulous job. He's a very, very smart man, and has a sympathy for the peasant parties, which I happen to share. So that was the one thing that was added in along the way. Okay, assist us.
Can I just add, from a contributor's point of view, from the very beginning, Sabrina shared the proposal with all of the contributors. As soon as she had it, which was 2 years out from the deadline for producing the chapters, she also shared her introduction and a sample chapter that she'd written, which made a huge difference when researching and writing this stuff. And every month or so, for at least a year, I would get an email in my inbox from Sabrina, which was nothing but a link to a music video. But it was a very quiet and subtle way of saying, come on, you realize you're supposed to be working on this and the due date's coming soon.
I like gentle reminders. I don't even have to say, remember the project, you know, just some interwar music, Kodai. Maybe I sent around the music is linked to Kodai. Could be.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I bet many people would like to get those emails from you.
I'm doing that right now with a project on civic and non-civic values in Czech Republic. And it turns out there are a lot of composers over the years, over the centuries in the Czech Republic. So about roughly every month or so, there's another birthday, Czech composer birthday, and I send a notification about it and a link to the music. I found one from the 1600s doing just beautiful Baroque religious music, just beautiful. Would have never encountered it if I hadn't been doing this approach my way.
Okay, I think that's quite an insight into publishing, and there's no doubt that that's how you edit, right? So many books. So let's move on now to the content of the book, and I'll let Francesco take over.
Yeah, first of all, let me thank the Society for Romanian Studies, not just for organizing this discussion, but even for giving me the chance to review the book. Let me start by saying that I enormously enjoy the book, and it's not up to me remarking again the quality of it, but I think that praising the book even here would make our discussion tedious and cheesy. So I will try to bring some other issues to our discussion and somehow challenge some of the book views. And the first one of my concern is the way how we interpret this interwar period in Central and Eastern Europe. In this regard, the book subtitle sends a clear message: failure of democracy building, fate of minorities. And while I was writing the review and throughout the years of my PhD, I asked myself if there is some other way to interpret these years, or if we are doomed to endlessly refer to the interwar period as a failure. I think we are not really. I think there is room for other interpretation. Interpretation that don't have to deny what we already know, but can add something new to the traditional views. I'm not implying that the interwar period represented a successful story as a whole, and we all know what happened. We all know how it ended. And so the authors of the book are perfectly right when they speak of failure of democracy building, and discrimination against ethnic minorities are undeniable. So I won't come here denying that. But what I really want to stress is that, in my opinion, at least in my very humble opinion, at least, it's possible to enumerate even the remarkable achievements that Central and Eastern European states were able to accomplish between those years, between 1918 and 1939. And I want to focus very briefly, because then I leave the floor to the authors of the book that know much more than me the whole situation. But I want to focus briefly on Romania, because we are guests of the Society for Romanian Studies, and because it's the country I know the most, since my research focuses on Romania. And I think if we take Romania as object of analysis, we can somehow, first of all, challenge the periodization of the interwar period and start to not see the interwar period as a coherent whole, and distinguishing between the 1920s and the 1930s, and even within the 1920s between the first phase of the transition and the rest. For example, Romania in 1920s achieved great results, bearing in mind the starting position of 1918. And just to mention a few domains, education, for example. Just think that in the early 20s, the Romanian state built from scratch 4,000 primary schools. And this is something that, in my opinion, cannot be overshadowed or underestimated. In 1919, Romania had 67 high schools. I noted this fact. 67 high school in 1919, and in 1928, Romania had 356. So I think this is something we should remember when we speak of the interwar period. Let's not talk about the artistic and literary achievements. Let me mention just a couple of names, Tudor Arghezi, Cesar Petrescu, Lucian Blaga, and all the authors that Romania was able to produce somehow in this period. And third point, and maybe the most controversial one, is minorities. And in this regard, I think even in this regard, there is room for nuances somehow. And I want to draw some example from my current research on judiciary in interwar Romania. And I found that Hungarians were really an active part of Romanian judicial life in the 1920s.
What part?
Hungarians in Transylvania.
Hungarians were something word missing part.
Hungarians were an active part of Romanian judicial life in the 1920s. Yeah, I found that Hungarian judges working in the Romanian Supreme Court, in the Curtea de Casație, and if you think it's very surprising that an Hungarian reached such a high position in the judicial hierarchy of the Romanian state. I found Hungarians in the Legislative Council of the Romanian state, and I found, and I have to thank Gabor Egri that brought this out to me, tens of Hungarian judges working in Transylvanian courts throughout the 1920s. So the 1920s are different from the following 10 years, and it's something we should really remark somehow. So these are my questions to the authors. Based on what we just said, there is room for reinterpreting somehow this period, and how can we challenge this traditional periodization?
Shall I go first? Say a few things. In terms of the periodization, for the region as a whole, I'm inclined to think that the appearance of the Third Reich, even though we don't count it among East Central European countries, was really decisive because of Hitler's intent to take over directly or indirectly as much of the region as he could. And the rise of Hitler dramatically affected the politics throughout. There's one example, of course, Czechoslovakia with the Süddeutsche Partei. But for the country where I spent the larger part of my career, which is to say Yugoslavia, the decisive turning point, I believe, and listen to the date, 6th of January, 1929. Was this somehow a prophecy of things to come? Or maybe not. But it was on the 6th of January, 1929, that King Alexander declared a dictatorship. And even though he later issued a constitution for the country, and there were some shifts with coalitions, etc., that is clearly marking a watershed. Political scientists tend to look for problems. We don't tend to look for things being good, without denying. I agree absolutely, Francesco, many good things. And certainly if one wants to have a book which really brings good things into play, Ivan Berend, although his focus is precisely on culture, music, art, which you found less interesting, I think. But Ivan Berend's book is absolutely brilliant, but it is a tour de force, it's not written as a textbook. Could be used as a textbook, of course, but it's not written that way. And as much as I love that book, I really love it, I couldn't imagine using it in my class. But Ivan Berend did a fabulous job, and I take nothing away from him on that score. When talking about failure, there are two ways to think about failure. There's what does the writer, researcher, observer think was a failure? We're all entitled to make such judgments, but there's also the issue about what were the locals trying to do, and did they fail? And each one of these countries started out with some sort of version of parliamentarism. So they said they were building parliamentary systems, and then one after the other, they fell apart. The only one which did not fall apart for internal reasons, but fell apart because of basically the Third Reich, was Czechoslovakia. And so, you know, there's a sort of what if question which comes up with Czechoslovakia. What if there'd been no Third Reich? What if Hitler had been a nice gentleman and just minded his own business? Would Czechoslovakia have emerged as a huge success? We don't know the answer to this. So I'm really not into these what if questions. There has to be a use for asking such a question. I don't see a use for that here. But there were a number of challenges which these elites faced in the early period. One of them was, of course, the issue of factions, different groupings. Maybe groupings is a better word. In Poland, for example, you had a more nationalist grouping, and you had a well, what looked at first socialist but really centrist grouping around Piłsudski. Any characterization of Piłsudski is going to be controversial, but I'm going to go with calling him a centrist. And so you had that, and then Piłsudski was putting people in prison, of course, along the way, including during one election period. The issue of minorities, which you mentioned, Francesco, is, of course, of fundamental importance, not merely for this book, but I think for any study of interwar East Central Europe. And when I look at this, I see a picture which is to some extent mixed. Certainly the country about which I wrote for this book, Czechoslovakia, the largest of the non-Slavic minorities, the Germans, initially had problems in employment. There was discrimination in employment and in education, and they after a while it got much better, much better. So the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years of the interwar republic for the German minority were in many ways quite good. But the Germans did make a big mistake, and that was a lot of them were so upset at being, maybe I should say that things were better from 1925 to 29. That's really the period when things were better. After 29, it's not so good, because the Germans, or Austrians, some considered themselves Austrians, didn't like being in a state run by another group, by Czechs and Slovaks, basically by Czechs or Czechoslovaks, if you prefer. And so they put their savings into German banks. And what happened? Well, the German banks fared very, very badly. And you had, of course, the massive inflation in Germany, and a lot of these people lost most of their money. So this was something which came along by the by. Land reform was also an area where there was this active discrimination against non-members of the titular nationality. So discrimination against non-Romanians in Romania, discrimination against non-Czechs in Czechoslovakia, etc. And of course, whenever you have discrimination, this is problematic. It erodes the legitimacy of the state. People find out that it's not like you have people who are unaware of what's going on. And one way or the other, although people do look to different standards for what is justice, certainly any politically active people will have a concept of what is justice, whether it's derived from natural law or from some notion of God's law or something else. There's a notion of what is justice and how it should be manifested in life. And this is really a driving force in politics. Corruption was also a big problem in the interwar era. You make rules, constitution, look, you got this right and that right and this right and that right. And then you look how it goes in practice. Oh yeah, well, you didn't actually get that or that or that. People see the disconnect, the politically active ones. And those who are politically aware, and they get, of course, inevitably very upset, and this drives protest, it drives erosion of legitimacy, and can ultimately drive change. And one more point that I like to make about the interwar era, which is about the revanchism, the discontent with borders. This was strongest in Hungary. I've long been struck, as anybody who studies East Central Europe and interwar era can only be struck, that the most active, prominent alliance in that era was an alliance uniting Czechoslovakia, Romania, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes / Yugoslavia against Hungary, an anti-Hungarian alliance. And this is, of course, because these countries were aware that they had annexed areas with compact populations of Hungarians who, if they had been allowed a referendum, would have voted to join Hungary. And so there was this understanding that the borders were not set in a free and open way. And so this drove revanchism, and of course, this proved to be a factor for instability, and certainly contributed to Hungary aligning itself with Hitler. So, to you, Roland, or Francesco.
Yeah, can I talk a bit about Romania? Because Francesco's points are spot on. The problem is that when you write a story, you need a beginning, a middle, and an end. You need somewhere to start and you need somewhere to finish, and things to work for that, which is one reason why we use this sort of periodization. The other way, some of the other reasons is it lets you get at what's coherent about this period, right? What Jamison calls the political unconscious is kind of stable within a certain periodization, whereas once you step out of that period, you find radical ruptures and changes. And it lets you emphasize what came before was different, what comes after was different. But you're right, what it hides is continuities. And that's a big thing, especially in when you're talking stories of modernization or education or things like this, where there were significant continuities between the pre-war and post-World War I period, and in industrialization post-World War II. I start my chapter with the Battle of Mărășești in 1917, and I end it in Transnistria with the Holocaust in somewhere around 1942. And if you want to find out what the connection between those two things is, you have to read the chapter. But I actually, if pushed, I would say that the interwar period in Romania is the story of Greater Romania. And so it really starts with the creation of Greater Romania and ends in September 1940 with the dismemberment of Greater Romania. And that allows you to tell a story about centralization, the incorporation of new provinces, and things like this. When Sabrina asked me to write this chapter, I thought to myself, so this is going to involve a lot of reading and make sure that I'm on top of the historiography. So I might as well write a historiographical essay at the same time, sort of alongside this piece, and talk about what are the historiographical trends on interwar Romania. And that essay is coming out in the next issue of the Journal of Romanian Studies. And in it, I argue that there's 4 basic stories that we tell about interwar Romania. The problems of a small state, the idea that Romania is this small state in a big Europe, and it's trying to wrestle with that. And that's a story that starts being told in the early 1920s. But really, it still dominates the secondary literature on interwar Romania today. There's the story of the collapse of democracy, which is what this volume's about. And it's the single most interesting, well, it's the one story that everyone wants to find out the answer to, especially both students and scholars whenever we're talking about this. Sabrina said that she can't imagine assigning Beren's book to, or using it as a textbook. I use it frequently as a textbook, and my students hate me for it.
Why do they hate you?
Because he's heavy. and he's much heavier than most second or third years are really used to reading.
It's a brilliant book, absolutely brilliant book. But so much of it is about culture. So if your students are interested in culture, they'll love it. If they're not interested in culture, well, they're going to say, what's all this doing in here?
And he forces you to actually get to know the material in really deep ways. Most recently, a fan of John Connolly's new book on East Central Europe, which came out very recently, and it's amazing to teach with. But
what years does he cover?
The Enlightenment to the present. I can't remember what it's called, but it's really, really useful. The other big narrative is the March of Progress, and that starts with Rolla in the 1940s and sort of dies with communism or with the end of state socialism. And the last one is the narrative that Irina Leveziano really kicked off, is the consequences of state building and centralization. And the problem with all of those four narratives is when you look at them carefully, they all give you the impression that Romania was intolerant and chauvinistic. And if you weren't male or Orthodox and ethnically Romanian, you had no place there. And as Francesco pointed out, that's totally untrue. The closer we look at this period, the more we see massive contributions by Germans, Hungarians, Jews, women, not to say the least.
Germans? Huh?
German Saxons.
Yeah.
And
Swabians.
and the real challenge in writing interwar Romanian history today, I think, is trying to bring all those narratives to put the story that we have or that we want to tell about the collapse of democracy or anything like that together with the stories about minorities, and not make them just a story of persecution, but a story of active survival and contributions in a multi-ethnic society, which is what I like about the subtitle to this volume. It's not just the collapse of democracy, it's also the fate of minorities and the involvement of minorities.
Okay, so we're on the almost like on a 40-minute mark. Thank you for your responses. If you have any follow-ups, or maybe if we can actually have some questions from the audience.
There's nothing on the Facebook page at the moment.
Okay. How about
One thing I can perhaps emphasize with this is that although the 4 or 5 previous books about the interwar period in East Central Europe, this is the first book in which each chapter is written or co-authored by someone fluent in the main language of the given country. I don't know Czech, but my co-author is Karol Skalnik-Lev is of course fluent in Czech. And I think this makes a real difference, being able to tap into the sources. I don't take anything away from the achievements of those who went before with their books, but still, this is something which makes our book unique.
Okay, so if there are any questions or some follow-ups, okay, we have both Philippe and Svetlana. Philippe, you can go ahead, and we'll save Svetlana for the next question.
Thank you.
Okay.
I find the idea of looking at the way how minorities were involved in public life in interwar period really interested. However, I think if we go deeper into it, we're going to see that it is a small group of people who you find all the time again in different positions. For instance, one Saxon you would find nearly everywhere is Rudolf Branch. And so aren't we risking to come back to the communist discourse, which was something like everything in Romania, in interwar Romania, was really wonderful. Minorities were involved, they were just collaborating, and going to forget about the fact that minorities were always second-class citizens, or even not at all citizens. I mean, there's also a big problem that a lot of people who actually were born in the territories that Romania occupied in 1917, 1918, had not the citizenship of Romania because of different administrative problems that were created. So to get rid of these people, that would be my question.
Yeah,
That's to you.
I don't think that pointing out that minorities were involved in public life is to say that minorities were not persecuted. What actually we look at when we look at minorities, and this is true of Philippe's work as of anyone's, is you're looking at the tactics and strategies that they use in order to participate in a society that actively discriminates against them. To bring the active discrimination to the fore and to talk about ethnic privilege and challenges of minority politics at the same time that you're talking about what they're doing, because otherwise you end up with a story which is largely the story of the archives. When you look at a lot of the Romanian archives, the minorities are silent, and what you see is the Romanian bureaucrats imposing their vision on the minorities, but you don't hear the minority voices kicking back. And I think we need both the kickback and the involvement. But again, to come back to something else that Philippe said, it's a small minority of people whose voices survive. And that is a very small minority, but at least it's slightly bigger than the tiny minority whose voices we had before. Yeah.
Sabrina, would you like to respond, or should we have Svetlana ask another question? Okay, so
Svetlana ask a question.
Okay, Svetlana, you have to turn on your mic.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation, and it's probably more a comment than a question. Nevertheless, I sensed from what Sabrina presented and Roland and also Francesco, this issue is an issue of differentiation. Yes, so it's not the state had not pursued the same policy towards minorities. Yes, so it's not majority and minorities, but it's in fact majority and different policies against minorities. Here comes into play territorial question, and then comes into play loyalty question. So if the Germans, for example, did not were in fact privileged comparing to the Hungarians, for example, in Transylvania, and then we have the other side of Romania, Russians. And we have Bulgarians, Germans, and other minorities, and we see that this differentiations goes close to together with this territorial question. Germany is far away, so it's not a question of questioning, so to say, the new border. So we leave it as it is. Let's automatically more tolerant, so to say, or more loyal to the new state, which was not necessarily the issue. I don't mean Germans here, but tolerance was in fact, and loyalty was measured by certain cliches that appeared this time, especially after 1918, and also how to say, when you implement agrarian issue you mentioned, for example, right? So here was a terrain of playing, yeah? So who gains more, who gains less, who is more loyal, and who is less loyal. And we see this very much an issue when it comes to expectations of minorities toward the states. And and how this, including land issue, was a factor which came into play while negotiating this status within the new political environment. So I think we lack such here comes in this issue of differentiation towards minority comes in several texts, and also this is something that we lack in historiography, in fact. Yeah, so specifically in Romanian historiography, which I know better, and this is an issue, an open issue, which needs more research. We do not measure. We don't need to, how to say, to grade and measure, but we need to understand what kind of motives, let's say, what kind of roles also these minorities play, not only one side understanding of the issue. So state policy and state failure of the state, but also responses, so to say reactions. And responses not only towards the state, but towards each other, minorities, majorities, minorities. I think this is maybe there is place for you know, going into deep in this respect. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree completely with what Svetlana just said. And can I mention 4 books that I think do well at trying to wrestle with this. And this is something that I think all of the authors in the current Interwar East Central Europe volume tried to do in their chapters. How successful were, I don't know. In terms of Romanian history, the first book that I remember picking up and going, wow, this is a genuinely multi-ethnic history of Romania, is Maria Bucur's Heroes and Victims. Because there she gives a whole heap of stories, and she does differentiate. She doesn't say minorities were all this or minorities were all that, but she points out different people encountered in different ways. 2 other more recent books. One is Chris Davis's Hungarian Religion, Romanian Blood, where he looks at the Changos and the way that they negotiated nationality politics in Interwar Romania, and they kick back at the state. And they're constantly negotiating with the state to work out what their status is. And then James Capallo's work on inner Kentism.
I'll be back. I need to check my soup.
Where we're not just talking ethnic minorities here, we're talking religious minorities. And how do they deal with change? And the last one is Mate Rigo's work. He, in his PhD, which he defended a couple of years ago, and he's turning into a book at the moment, he says, let's forget about looking from the state level, and let's look at industrialists. And by talking about industrialists and big bankers and finance people, he's able to completely shift the terms of debate about Interwar Romania, and everything we thought we knew about what makes an ethnic, about the status of Jews or the status of different minorities, gets turned on its head as soon as you bring in Bing Bunny. And so it's actually, I think what we really need is new perspectives and new angles, and maybe not necessarily to rehash the same questions about what the state does, although we're getting better at it.
If I may, what came to my mind, an article of Mariana Haus-Leitner about cooperatives in Romania, which is also something very new. So if you look at cooperatives and who owned those cooperatives and what was the role of the Jews and how, in fact, these cooperatives survived, part of them, not every cooperative. I mean, still part of them survived, and in which region, so we can compare through this perspective of cooperatives, we can compare what happened, in fact, what was the fate of the Jews and how the state reacted.
Okay, I think it's time for dinner, unless Sabrina, if you want to say something.
Yeah, I'd like to make a contrast between pre-1914 and post-1918. If you look at the pre-1914 period, you had dominating the central part of our region, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a multi-ethnic empire. And even though it did have internal tensions ethnically, the Hungarians in particular demanded and obtained a significant autonomy. And the Czechs, among the rest of the groups, the Czechs were probably the most restless. Nonetheless, there was within Austria-Hungary a notion that there could be a multi-ethnic empire, and there were a number of initiatives in its last decades to try to salvage that empire and move it forward. What developed in the course of, although obviously ethnic attachment, loyalty, and nationalism, sense of nation predated World War I. Nonetheless, there were two big impulses to this concept of national self-determination, which emerged in the course of the years associated with World War I. The first, it was Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, where he said that if you've got a group of people, same nationality and want to live together, they should be able to do so. That was not honored. And the second was, of course, Lenin, who applied this to the people of the Russian Empire. And for very sensible reason, he understood that he was going to be lucky to hold on to part of the country. So rather than fighting everybody, just let the Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians go their own way and see what comes later. The problem with that, which I see, is that in particular Wilson's 14 points, it inspired a lot of people. It really got some people, the politically active members of ethnic minorities, excited. They said, look, there's hope. We have the President of the United States backing our move for independence, for national self-determination. So it gave an energy to this idea. And then, of course, it wasn't really carried out in anything like a consistent way. And when I look at the piece of the sundry Paris peace treaties, these were treaties which were drafted certainly in part, and perhaps we want to say in the first place, but I'm not going to stress that. Certainly in part, they were drafted with the interests of the major allied powers in mind. So France in particular, and Great Britain. And these two had some ideas, and Clemenceau, of course, wanted very much to punish Germany. And so this came into play in the Versailles Treaty. And what you did not see operative there was people sitting down in Paris and saying, what decisions can we make to promote the long-term peace and stability for the region? They didn't talk about it like that. That was one of the tragedies of that era.
Can I just ask one quick question before we leave? Dorina, how was the soup?
It's doing okay. The cabbage is just right. It's a sort of a general vegetable soup with cabbage as the main ingredient.
Oh, that's tasty.
And there will be tacos together with it. Sorry you can't all come.
Yeah, I have some tortillas too, but hopefully at one point we'll be able to meet us. So thank you to meet each other. Thank you all for participating. I hope this was as interesting for you as it was for us, the organizers. Keep an eye on the book, or find the book if you haven't read it yet, and keep an eye on the Journal of Romanian Studies with Roland's piece, which is going to be published in April. And in the meantime, we have one last book panel of the season On March 31st, there's going to be a discussion of Dorina Roshka's book about Moldova, and Petru Negura is going to be he's the reviewer. So thank you again for participating. Have a good evening, and Sabrina, enjoy the soup.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao, bye.